Hello, I'm James McCullough. With me today, my guest is Daniel Côté Davis, a teacher, a writer and an artist. And he's here to talk to us about Tolkien. Welcome, Daniel.
Thank you very much for having me.
My first question is really to give us a background, please, on Tolkien's faith. Where was he coming from?
Well, it's a long story of love, I have to say, with Tolkien, and it's really going back to his mother, who was a very strong Catholic herself, to the point of being a convert from the Anglican faith.
Right.
And that was a choice that she made, Mabel Tolkien, at great personal cost. She was actually disinherited by her family for making that choice of faith at a time where sort of the ecumenical movement hadn't really started. And Tolkien was caught up in all that. He actually lost his father as well, so became an orphan.
Right.
And at that stage, his link to Catholicism became really formalised because he was taken into the care of a Catholic priest called Father Francis Morgan. Now, Father Francis Morgan has a direct connection to John Henry Newman. So the connection with Catholicism is there from a very early stage, with the long tradition in England of the resurgence of the Catholic faith.
Yes.
Because Newman, of course, was involved with the Second Spring, the emancipation of Catholics. So there's this whole line consistent with the Catholic tradition coming in his own formation, and which he then sort of continued in his own personal life, although he struggled a little bit with his faith, admittedly, losing it partially, some biographers say, in earlier stages of his life. It came back with great devotion, and I want to talk about specifically how that faith illumined his whole project.
Right, because Tolkien's work is known to have been, by his own admission in his letters, a fundamentally Catholic and religious work. Could you give us some signs of where this happens particularly?
Yeah, absolutely. So fundamentally means at its root he is being inspired by the whole Catholic vision, which he will have inherited in his youth, but then come to learn more formally in his own personal struggle, I would say, to find his faith. His biography takes him to the war, and he serves in the war, and in a quite dramatic fashion loses the majority of his friends.
Right.
So there's a great trauma that underlies his life, as I mentioned already, with the loss of his mother, and then the loss of his friends. So there's a suffering that colours his life. And I think specifically it was through that suffering that he came to deepen his own private understanding of faith. So he had it from his formation with Father Francis Morgan, but then it really became something that entered into his whole psychology, and then really deeply into his heart, I would say. So everything that he's writing is being drawn out of this great wealth of a love for two things, I would say: the Eucharist and the Blessed Mother of God, the Virgin Mary. So these are really the pillars, the foundational pillars of his writing.
Right.
And that can be sort of great details of this can be worked out when you go into the plot itself, and I don't want to, I could talk for hours on this, and sure. I could open it up, but he wasn't really saying, I'm going to write allegory, I'm going to make some formal comparisons between characters, and this character is Our Lady specifically.
Okay.
It was more the love of the Eucharist and the love of Our Lady gives a certain vision of life where God is present in everything.
I see.
And so when he's writing about Middle-earth, he's inheriting that Catholic traditional perspective that the whole of creation is illumined by the love of God and the presence of God. And this tradition is so old, because if you go back to when the Gospel was originally translated before the Reformation into English, they come to translate the passage where Jesus says, in Old English, he'll say, "Jesind middenjar des licht." Okay, this is what Jesus says. Now, if you translate what Jesus says into modern English, it is the literal translation is, "You are the light of Middle-earth." That's what Jesus tells his learning knightum, is the word, the learning knight or the learning servant, the disciple. So you are the light of Middle-earth. Now, Middle-earth is such a long, long story from this land. It will come before the literature, it will be in the oral traditions. It will come with the stories of the people who migrated to this land. Middle-earth is in the Norse language. It's in the Old English language. It's very much related to this land, and it's a place where God is present. But then you also have, the giants and the elves, and you have the force of evil, the force of good. You have a whole dramatic literary context for expressing the spiritual life, for expressing the journey of faith. But within that, his personal devotion to the Eucharist and Our Lady, and this medieval understanding, we sort of look at medieval and say, oh, it's quite a pejorative thing nowadays, I would say.
Yeah, absolutely.
You say, oh, that's quite medieval.
Yeah.
Well, I have a lot of medievalist friends, and they, spend a lot of time on social media trying to undo this particular pejorative line of thought, because, look at the cathedrals, look at the tradition that we inherit as people in England.
Yeah.
And, we'll go on holiday and it will be Christmas or it'll be Easter.
Yes.
That's the time where we know to be at leisure, to celebrate, to have joy. What is the root? Where can we find the roots of these things in literature, tradition, writing? And Tolkien is really a figure who's trying to answer that question, but he's decisively pitching himself as an Oxford professor on the side of the Eucharist and Our Lady, and trying to return that into at least the narrative and context of Englishness, English identity, the relationship with the land.
Right.
So there's a lot to explore there, but particularly his Catholic vision is absolutely central, I would argue.
Yeah. Is it as simple as saying, can we literally say that Middle-earth is our present reality when you think of maybe the higher realm being heaven and lower being hell? Is it as simple as that, or is that too literal?
No, I think that's correct theologically. So he would have got this from Father Francis Morgan. He would have got this from the early death of his mother. He's aware that, temporal things pass.
Okay.
Many people analyse Tolkien's writings and say, really, he's concerned with death and eternity. That is the theme, the major theme. And it would make sense, because that path of suffering, if you lose your friends, you lose your parents, you're aware that you're in transition. And if there's no heaven, then, what is your life about?
Absolutely, yeah.
So the suffering is very real for him. But he's not conjuring anything up out of the air like Saruman, He's actually inheriting a tradition that is even before Christianity, Midgard.
Yeah.
I mean, the Nordic mythology has Midgard.
Yes.
Right. He's sensing that there is a way of communicating Christ, communicating the gospel, communicating the illumination that comes from the gospel, the light of Christ, in a way that's so natural to this land, to being in England, that the way he phrased it was like he was going into the kind of the soup of the stories, and so he could reconnect the human heart to Christ. I mean, Bishop Barron refers to Tolkien as a master evangelist for this project,
right?
In bringing Tolkien into a conversation about evangelizing again, the new evangelization as it's known. Because the new evangelization, as John Paul II would say, the best way to evangelize is to start to know the stories. You need to know the stories first. Then when you know the stories, you can connect the human heart to the truth.
Right.
And that's a great style of evangelism. And the style that Christ himself used. I mean, he was a storyteller.
Yes, of course. The parables and so on. Yeah.
Storytelling is the primary art of God's way of communicating to us.
Yeah,
our whole lives will unfurl within a narrative, and we talk about ourselves, what happened to you at the weekend, what are you doing, in the next few years. You enter into story. You have to enter into story to be a social being, to develop a sense of your identity.
Yes.
And even people who are trying to market through economics, or
yes.
they're going to have to tell stories to entice people to buy their products, or story is the mode by which we really do communicate our essence, our identity.
And so the clearer the story, the better the evangelization in this context that we're talking about here, really.
And really, I think what's resonating with people when they come to Tolkien is they identify their own personal journeys with this wider journey. And people nowadays are looking to, in a world that doesn't know God, doesn't know Christ, they want to find meaning.
Yeah.
So it would make sense that people come to Tolkien and start to find a meaningful narrative.
Right.
But what I'm so excited about saying is that the meaningful narrative to be discovered is not a new narrative to discover, really. And Chesterton was saying this. He was saying, imagine the man who goes around the whole world looking for something, the truth. And when he finds it, he plants his flag in the ground. He says, well, I've got it, I've found it. I've devoted my whole life to finding that which I've sought to find. And then turns around and discovers there's a great cathedral behind him at that point of discovery. So
Right.
there's a real sense that our own stories, our own identity, it can come into a kind of point of commonality. And really behind all that is God telling a story as well.
I see.
And returning to Bishop Barron, who's a great fan of Tolkien,
Right.
a really, really great fan. You go on his website, you type in Hobbit, you type in Tolkien, you get pages and pages and pages.
Okay.
As I said, referring to him as the master evangelist, he will always return to this point that specifically on evangelization, responding to our vocation, our call from God, is a way of uniting our own story to God's story. And God is telling a story. So Tolkien is really starting to cover these themes in everything that he writes about. All his stories resonate with the gospel in different ways.
Right, as we'll see.
We'll see.
Let's focus now on his work in more detail. What is meant by the sacramental vision of the Lord of the Rings?
So I've touched upon this a little bit, I think, but it's worth unpacking. And my statements about the Eucharist and Mary being particular to Tolkien, I think, are quite, I wouldn't say controversial, but you could set up a whole conference and say, Tolkien the pagan, and you'd get a lot of people and they'd come because it's subtle. The art is subtle. And that's wonderful because Jesus says, be innocent as doves, but cunning as serpents. So a good evangelization is attractive because it touches all the aspects of culture.
Right.
So specifically with Tolkien, though, he really devotes his life pouring into the whole medieval canon. And he really searched for stories that really resonated. But touching all of this was a kind of darkness and frustration, even spiritually. And he came to make this statement where he said, out of the darkness of my life, so much frustrated, I put before you the one great thing to love upon the earth. Now, what's he going to say? Because there's lots of things to love on the earth. and he says the blessed sacrament. He says, there you will find fidelity, honor, romance, glory, and death. Death. So death doesn't sound like something you would like to find, but
well, through death, redemption.
That's what he says. He says, death, the divine paradox, that which gives life and eternal endurance to all your loves upon earth. Now, this theme of death, as I've already mentioned, is colouring his life. He has the death of his mother. He has the death of his friends. So we see this theme of death emerging through his writing. But it's always touched by the immortality that as a Christian he is sensing is the core experience of life. He had to make up a word to try and describe it. He was always one to make up words. But he called it the eucatastrophe. Eudaimonia in Greek, happiness, catastrophe. You look around you, read any newspaper, live your life. It's going to be coloured by catastrophe. He actually called your wife your companion in shipwreck. He said that a wife is not a guiding star, she's a companion in shipwreck. So he was aware that the catastrophic in the daily life is, on a mythic scale. But for the Christian, it's a happy catastrophe because there are certainties that you can stick by. And one of them was the Eucharist. That God is truly present in the Eucharist, body, blood, soul and divinity, as Catholics would say. And so we can come there with the whole catastrophe of life and find something eternal, which we can then return to the world and bring that eternal, enduring love to transform it. So he really did see the Eucharist as being central to the transformation of the world. And that really does colour his characters. All of his characters are called on his heroes anyway, are always called to death.
Right.
Death is always the kind of fundamental goal of their vocational narratives.
Yes.
Bilbo is a very famous example, called by Gandalf to sign his life away, and there's a great list of the myriad ways that he can die. So I remember when I was younger, I was speaking to a priest about this, and he actually ended up putting the vocations spiel for the diocese framed in the context of Bilbo. So, the myriad ways you can die. But the point is that death is fruitful. In so many ways. Yeah. And the death of Bilbo, at least spiritually, to give his life away to go on the adventure, it reaps a great reward.
It's sacrificial.
It's sacrificial. It's sacrificial. And that is the sacramental vision, is that the Eucharist is source of life for the world. And we see this in Tolkien, in his characters who are making choices of death. Arwen, she leaves her immortality out of love. These are great Christian symbols of love. Yeah, they're not allegories. Tolkien despised allegory, actually, in all its forms. Okay. So he wasn't a fan of C.S. Lewis' sort of Aslan Christ. Yes. He always found Catholicism was more subtle, and sort of the attraction comes through the art first. Yes, I see. And then through that you can be led to things like. Our Lady is always very subtle. Right. It's being led. It's being led. It's presence. Yes. So you can sense Our Lady's presence. Yes. You can sense the Eucharistic presence. And I can talk more about Our Lady, but specifically the Eucharist. The point on the Eucharist for Tolkien was, having lived his life and with all his great experiences, he came to realise, so much frustrated, that the only thing that could give eternal endurance to his love was the Eucharist. Right. And that's a point, I think, that needs to be emphasised when we talk about Tolkien's writings. We talk about his imagination. We talk about his own biography, the choices that he made, his own sanctity, the way that he became a holy person and drew a lot of people to Christ through his works. Right. The central pillar there, one of them is the Eucharist, the other is Our Lady. So these are really, really important aspects of Tolkien's project.
So Daniel, we're in Walsingham today. What is the relationship between Tolkien and Our Lady?
Well, I'm absolutely delighted to be in Walsingham, because Walsingham really expresses the English story and the English love of Our Lady, going back to the kings of England and queens of England who came to devote and consecrate the whole of England to Our Lady. Yes. Right up until the Reformation. And even King Henry VIII himself made the pilgrimage barefoot with all his retinue. Yes. So there's a long, long tradition for a good part of Anglo-Saxon Catholic life. The majority of the churches were entrusted to Our Lady in this land. Yeah. Her presence amongst the English people is foundational. So Tolkien himself, being schooled in the medieval tradition, the Anglo-Saxon language, he comes to make this statement about his faith and about his art. And he says, everything I have learnt about beauty, in its simplicity and magnificence, I learnt from the Blessed Virgin Mary. Right. Now that is an astounding comment. The amount of people who will come to Tolkien without faith at all and will say, well, this is a tremendously beautiful piece of work. Yeah. I'm going to, devote a significant amount of my time to exploring it, becoming more and more fascinated and captivated by Middle Earth, which, as I've explained, is our reality. Yes. To then say, what is at the core of our reality that underpins everything? Right. Is Our Lady. She's at the center of this land and its story. And that's an extraordinary thing, because I think Our Lady's presence is always very gentle, very humble. You think about another example of a culture being captivated by the presence of Our Lady would be Our Lady of Guadalupe. Sure. Now, in her apparition, she's totally related to the locals and their stories and their customs, and she's dressed in the clothing of Mexico. Yeah, yeah. So what would it mean for Our Lady to come to England? And this is what the story of Walsingham starts to say. Well, she is a sort of domestic presence. She brings the house of Nazareth. So I had a priest say to me once, where better to hide than behind her pinny? It's that kind of domestic joy and familiarity. Yeah. That is the presence of Our Lady. And this has very much coloured our land. And then behind that, you have the emergence of the Hobbit for Tolkien, a hobbit. Simplicity, joy.
Yep.
And joy being really, really important, because joy is something hard to come by. It's something you receive. You can't manufacture it. So there is this underlying sense in The Lord of the Rings that really the evil is tyrannical. It is so powerful, it is so present, it is so forceful, and is so organized. And it's militating against these simplistic, not in a negative sense, but these simple virtues that really are the way to destroy these great powers. Now that is a story that is told universally in every culture. The destruction of the dragon, the destruction of the malevolent force. But what's colouring Tolkien's vision is the Marian presence, but always very subtly. So 2 examples. The Fellowship of the Ring, when it's formed to destroy the tyrannical presence of Sauron, the great demon, they leave Rivendell on Christmas Day.
Right.
So Tolkien is very aware of the medieval calendars and with all his studies and research. So he's very clever to situate certain events on certain days. So obviously Christmas Day is the birth of Christ, Christ the Son of Our Lady. And so her presence is already there at the commissioning of the fellowship that's going to destroy the Ring of Power, the presence of evil in Middle-earth. And when does that destruction happen? Very, very precisely on the Feast of the Enunciation. So for Tolkien, he's got that whole circle returning to, because the Enunciation for the medievals was also the feast day of the crucifixion. They brought those 2 days into one, as it were.
Okay.
So, and there's a great theology behind that, which you could explore at great length, because the graces given to Our Lady were won at the cross by Christ. And we had an Englishman defend that, Duns Scotus, in the Oxford University, which Tolkien himself was a professor in. As an Oxford scholar, as someone who loved this country and its stories, and was very well versed in the language and literature, had brought The Hobbit out as a sort of quintessential pre-Reformation Englishman. But I don't mean that in a sort of historical sense, that we should return back to before the Reformation, where we don't have any technology or any of these things. It's more the spiritual truth which endures. So is there a way that we can return to the foundations of our joy? That is the question I think that Catholics should reflect on in England. What are the foundations of our joy? Because the world needs joy, and joy is a gift. And there is no capitalist enterprise, there is no amount of marketing or clever conversation that can bring about joy. It's a gift.
And it's interesting, I remember from the book of The Lord of the Rings, where Frodo is in the middle of Mordor. They're lying there, almost dying. They've almost given up hope, that they could have done. But it's joy, it's Frodo's joy and Sam that then they sort of find a sort of extra energy, a strength from their joy. Those are the virtues which are suddenly coming out, and in the time of when they're facing this persecution.
These
Maybe
are
a message for our day.
Absolutely constant themes, to return to the joy. And absolutely, if we could start to relate this specifically to the challenges of today, yes, there is increasingly the sense that there are myriad problems, but there's always opportunity with Our Lady. I think Tolkien is sensing this. So in his stories, as you mentioned, in the mouth of hell itself, Mount Doom, it's the simple joys that reawaken the human heart. So what does Sam remember? He remembers the taste of strawberries.
Yes.
And rosy cotton with flowers in her hair. If there was anyone who would have married, it would have been her. So the returning to the heart, that's a way to rekindle the presence of the Holy Spirit. And a heart in the Holy Spirit, well, that can bring down structures. Read the Bible. It's filled with stories of the Holy Spirit entering into the human heart, and then all the structures of evil, well, they fall apart. Because God's presence in the human heart is more powerful than any institution, any power, any authority. So these are profound themes. And you sense them elsewhere as well. There's a beautiful passage that I think a lot of people are touched by in the Lord of the Rings, where Sam sees a star in the heavens, in the desolation of the lands just outside of Mordor.
Right.
And that reawakens again a sense of the eternal story for him, and gives him the courage to continue. And I was once in the Royal Albert Hall with my fellow Englishmen and English ladies watching Tolkien's third film, The Return of the King, conducted by Howard Shore. And I think we can all say we were very touched by particularly the point where Sam carries Frodo up Mount Doom. That is a profound vision, I think, of what evangelization is all about.
It's also it's Calvary, the way of the cross.
It's Calvary, it's the way of the cross, it's the path of disciple. You see these images of Jesus, the good shepherd who carries the lost sheep home. But you know, we're supposed to do this for our fellow humans.
Yeah.
No, the joy that we know of knowing Christ, knowing Our Lady, that's the kind of bravery I think Tolkien is teaching us, that death that brings life. It's really as beautiful as, you know, carrying a friend into the jaws of certain death, but with a hope that is illumined from a source that is beyond all the pain and suffering. So that is such a human point, I think, such humanity in Sam, really the hero of the Lord of the Rings, carrying Frodo up to certain death. Yeah, people find a great resonance, I think, with this, a great humanity, and that's really the primary way of evangelizing a very broken world is an increase in humanity. That was one of the messages of the Second Vatican Council, was the way of the church is the way of humanity, which sounds like a secular mantra, but it's the incarnation. It's always been the message. So loving God, serving the Holy Spirit, or as Tolkien called it, the secret fire. It's not opposed to our humanity. It takes us down to the core of our humanity, where we can really witness to something at the profundities of the heart, right?
Yes. So there's so much to explore.
There is a lot to explore.
And where do you see traces of the saints or martyrs in Tolkien's works?
Well, I think I've started to open this up with the idea of the death that brings life. I mean, that is a witness.
Sure.
And that is a continual theme in the Lord of the Rings. And you look at these English people who went to Tyburn. Tyburn was a gallows just outside Marble Arch in London. 105 English people faced the worst execution I think this land has ever known. They were dragged behind horses, hung by their necks, and cut into four. And there was you were told that this would happen to you before it did, with a chance to recant. And what were you supposed to recant? You're supposed to recant that you were a Catholic in England, because it had become a crime under Elizabeth.
Sure.
So 105 people decided not to do this. Campion would have been a good example.
Yes.
The Jesuit priest Campion. Now, what is underlying this witness? Because actually one of the things that coloured the Tyburn martyrs in their martyrdom was their joy.
Right.
So returning again to this joy, there was a joy. What was the joy? The joy was knowing something that needs to be shared. So the martyrs, they wanted to share something that was really at the core of their identity as English people. And it was that witness to the joy of knowing Our Lady, knowing the Eucharist. Those were the reasons they died. So Tolkien, again, being in love with the Eucharist, being in love with Our Lady, is very much part of that story. Now you can see it, I would say, draw immediately from two characters in The Lord of the Rings. You have a parallel of two characters who choose to die. Right. And the reasons they do it are very different. And there you see the difference between paganism and faith, in a way, a certain form of pagan despair. So you have it even in the etymology of the characters' names. You have Denethor, clearly a pagan name, Thor, Viking god. Now he, in the face of terrible evil, and his son, he fears his son is dead. He decides to throw himself, it's very well done in the films, off the ramparts of his castle, burning ablaze into the mouth of death, and the armies of evil are coming upon the castle. So this is a kind of witness, but what is it a witness to? I mean, it's certainly not to hope in the presence of looming death and agony and suffering. So you have this particular vision, but then you have Theoden. You see, they're occurring at the same point in the story. So you have Denethor and Theo is God, right?
Yeah, of
Theo
course.
is God.
Yes.
Now, he also goes to death, and I mean, it could be interpreted as suicide. I mean, it certainly is a suicidal mission in the sense that he is facing the Witch King of Angmar, right?
Oh, so
I mean,
yes,
anybody
sure.
going to do that is a nutter, as they
Yes.
might say in Hobbiton, right?
Yes, yes.
He wouldn't want to do
No,
that.
sure.
But he's not committing suicide. He's witnessing
Mm.
to his kingdom, the kingdom of Rohan.
Mm-hmm.
In fact, his cry in front of his horsemen is death.
Mm.
Death, death, death.
Okay.
They all charge.
Mm.
But that death is one that's illumined by the presence of the light that they see. And this light is the light of Middle-earth.
Yes.
So they're standing for eternal truths. They're standing, and in that sense, the death becomes a sacrifice.
Mm.
And you see this motif again and again and again. We had it with Luthien,
Yes.
who was the story upon which Arwen is based upon. They're both giving their lives for love,
Right.
both of them.
Yeah.
It's everywhere. Every in a sense,
Yeah.
you have a kind of constant journey of discipleship, I'd say, in all the characters. They are all, in a way, becoming like Christ.
Yeah.
Christ is the one who dies and gives life.
Mm.
So those who are on the side, in Middle-earth, of the Creator, of God, of the light,
Mm-hmm.
the servants of the secret fire, as Gandalf says,
Okay.
they are always on this discipleship path of dying,
Mhm.
taking on the agonies and sufferings of the world on themselves, in the struggle to fight for all that is good in this world, Mr. Frodo.
Mm.
That's the way that Sam says it.
Yes, I remember.
It's all there in the names, even Frodo. Frodo
Mm.
is a Norse name, King of Peace, it means.
Right.
So it's all there, it's hinted at.
King of Peace is a very Christ-like connection
and he's
there.
not Christ. He can't throw the ring away. He's not capable. He doesn't have the power. He doesn't have the authority to do it. He's just a broken disciple like the rest of us, right?
Yes.
But
yes.
but there's so much capacity for good and love in him.
Yeah.
And the evil really in the Lord of the Rings is just the absence of good. And Tolkien,
Yeah.
being a good Augustinian theologian, schooled by Father Francis Morgan, who was a pupil of Cardinal Newman, he would have known that point.
Mm.
It's absolutely central to good Catholic theology. Evil is just the absence of good.
Yeah.
And
yeah.
so the machinations of Saruman,
Mhm.
Sauron's own pride,
Mhm.
these are what brings the desolation. This is what brings the desolation to Middle-earth.
Yes.
But it really is just the absence of good.
And I think for me, hope is a key theme running through Tolkien's work, hope, because you find these characters in desperate situations where they're still displaying, through their joy and through other virtues, they're displaying their hope.
And what a message for today.
Yeah.
Because really this is the crisis I think we found in a post-Christian culture,
Right.
is the inability to deal with suffering. Because it doesn't sit well with us. And even from a theological perspective, it isn't what we were made for.
Right.
It's a consequence of something that was unnatural to us. Death is unnatural to human beings. Suffering is a cause of the fall.
Mm.
It's become a means of salvation through the crucifixion of Christ. But without that light, now in a post-Christian world, suffering is the first thing we're trying to remove.
Absolutely.
You see that with
Yeah.
the debate on abortion,
Mhm.
which is a debate that does reflect on ultimately questions of suffering,
Mhm. Mhm.
and in a lot of situations, and that's why the argument in favour of abortion is a good argument to the degree that it says, we need to work for a culture where we can help people who are suffering. So to that degree, it's a Christian argument to try and help someone in suffering.
Mm-hmm.
But have we found the best answer
Right.
by promoting abortion? Is that the best possible answer we can give? That's really what's being debated. But specifically, suffering is the thing we just don't want to look at.
And we distract ourselves from suffering with, our eating, drugs, alcohol, whatever substance or thing we can distract ourselves with to cope with the suffering of life. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's specifically on that, and then end of life as well.
Sure.
Let's try and eradicate any suffering. If there's suffering at the end of the life, let's end the life. So we can't deal with suffering. We don't know what to do with it. What Tolkien is trying to say, as someone who has suffered, so he has a right to talk on the issue, he's trying to say that there is a way that the story can come to a resolution even if there's great suffering, And I mean, Frodo is an exemplar of this. I was always touched by Frodo when I actually, to grow in my faith in Christ. So in a way, I learnt Christ through Frodo. I know it sounds a bit ridiculous, but I was touched by these images greatly of even Peter Jackson, who's not a Christian. He was dealing with Frodo, trying to portray Frodo. And you watch Frodo on his journey, which is essentially life. Tolkien is trying to say, I guess drawing from his own experience, that there will be suffering, it's inevitable.
Yeah.
There is an option always to choose. It's a choice. And I think that there is a sense here that, you know, God is going to respect us to be free. But the choice that's being given to Frodo is, you know, are you going to take the ring to Mordor? Are you going to die? Are you going to suffer terribly? And it's very beautifully done in the film, because Gandalf knows what's being asked, and his face has a lot of sorrow and wisdom in it. And then there's a lot to be said, I think, in Frodo, who then at that point says, I will take the ring to Mordor, though I do not know the way, which is that is a vocational statement.
It is.
That is the path of the disciple. That is the disciple who is going to suffer, is going to struggle, doesn't know the way, but has a master, right? And is going to learn.
Right.
Learn the path of love. So there is really a hope that does colour these decisions, but it's not a hope that isn't rooted in suffering, I don't think, because that kind of hope it's not attractive to people, and people can see through it. You know, if the hope that's being offered isn't real, and it doesn't speak to people where they are in the pain that they have, then it's not worth much.
Sure,
but I think the integrity of Tolkien's work is that it is drawing out of his own personal suffering a creative wealth of a kind of healing story that everyone can enter into, which is essentially drawing its spiritual treasures from the Eucharist and Our Lady, that give a sense and meaning to suffering. They don't leave suffering as something in the corner of the room to be forgotten.
So Daniel, how do you think that Tolkien's faith can inspire the new evangelization of the English Church?
It's an absolutely brilliant question, and it's one that I think is really, really, really important, particularly because England has a beautiful, noble tradition. And a lot of countries around the world resonate with the story of the English people. We have a history of good law, of civility, of love of family, love of animals. There's a whole story there that's rooted in our land, rooted in our stories, rooted in our identity. So what is the new evangelization anyway? That would be the first question. Well, the new evangelization is the idea that the gospel needs to be proposed again to people who may have even heard it originally. And I think we do encounter that a lot in England. There's almost like a boredom with the gospel.
Yes.
It's boring.
Okay.
Right? Because you go into your village, and of course you're going to find a medieval church.
Yes.
Or you're going to find some kind of parish, or the names are going to speak about the Christian story. But it isn't attractive anymore because we're too familiar with it.
Sure, yes.
So Bishop Barron, when he deals with Tolkien, he says, look, now Tolkien's wise here. He says we have to throw it back into the wild adventure that it's always been, right? What made St. Peter willingly be crucified in the public square, right? What made him do that? I mean, you might go into your quaint English village and enjoy the flowers in a way where you glorify the Creator, and then the village church might be St. Peter's, and it might look very nice. What is the story that underlies that beautiful little village church where, you know, the local English people are buried in the land there, their souls resting? It's the crucifixion of a man upside down in the public square, right? That's what's being proposed. Yeah, it's so dramatic. We need to get past the sandwiches and the politeness, right? Because underlying it is a drama of death. And that's been lost. Let's be less English about it, in other words. Well, no, hang on. I don't think it's let's be less English about it. I think it's let's return to our stories. Okay. If you go back to the Anglo-Saxons, they were very aware of this level of reality. Yeah. So Christ is portrayed as the warrior,
Right.
You go and read The Dream of the Rood, which is an old English reflection on the cross.
Mm-hmm.
These are the first ways our mystics and writers and those who fell in love with Christ wrote about him in this land.
Mm.
And Christ is the young warrior who mounts the gallows for the redemption of mankind. I mean, you see that resonated in Campion.
Mm-hmm.
He's mounting the gallows as well. I mean, that's the word in Old English.
Sure.
He's mounting the gallows for the redemption of mankind. The kind of love that's going to transform the world has to be on that level. It has to be a love that goes to the depths of the human heart, embraces the depths of all of human experience in the good and the bad.
Yeah.
But specifically, how are we going to do this? How are we going to reconnect to the true story? Mm. Because the true story is far from boring. I promise you. Boredom is actually a symptom of the absence of the Holy Spirit.
Right.
Because
right.
Chesterton is saying, God creates a flower, and then he creates another one, and then he creates another one, and another one, because each one is delightful. So there's no boredom in God. God is actually constant creativity.
Yeah.
So a culture that's becoming bored, that's becoming absent-minded, that's becoming sort of, you think of a smartphone like a ring. Mm-hmm. It's a good, the ring from the Lord of the Rings. You sort of stroke it, and then you sort of you vanish. You vanish.
Yeah.
You're no longer there. So the ring wraiths, they're real. They're everywhere.
Interesting point.
Spectres of their true selves.
Yeah. So it's now actually it's getting away from our complacency, not our Englishness, but our complacency, and seeing life for what it really is, a drama.
Well, there is a drama. Let's be candidly honest. Okay, we talk about abortion. Okay. If we want to be part of the solution, it's going to require a heroic solution. It's going to require a dramatic solution. If you want to really evangelize, you need to go to the place of suffering, go to the places where evil is present in the culture, and that's where the heroic narrative is really happening. So the new evangelization is going to be to return to our heroic examples of faith. And see what are the source of evil and suffering and challenges today in England, and what does the Eucharist, what does Our Lady teach us to do in these situations? Now, everybody can be involved in different ways, and really the joy of the Hobbiton, right, is that every individual within the village and the community has a purpose, has a role in their littleness, right? You see, Gandalf makes a fantastic statement. He says, evil isn't kept away by, Mother Teresa was making this the same point, by grand acts. It's the ordinary acts of little people, right, that's keeping the evil away.
It's interesting that the people of Hobbiton, for me, were portrayed as very complacent of evil.
Yeah.
That it's in another land. It's not here. Yeah. It will never come to us.
Absolutely.
And
brilliant.
therefore we don't need to worry.
Brilliant. That is the point. So it takes sort of an Enunciation moment. Gandalf comes like Our Lady knocking, or not Our Lady, like the angel Gabriel knocking to Our Lady. Bilbo isn't Our Lady. He's sort of not immaculate. He's not the Immaculate Conception, so he has to think about it. He has to say no, and then wake up in the boredom of his comfort. And then he makes what Pope Francis calls the exodus outside of the self. He's going to go on a grand old journey, right? So for me, particularly in my work in evangelizing, I've started to develop camps for young people where we use the Lord of the Rings as a kind of imaginative source of inspiration for writing a mythology that the children can enter into as a way for them to learn about the sacraments and Our Lady. So I developed a realm called Silverion. It means the kingdom of the Holy Spirit. And we actually use a monastery in New Zealand, so Middle Earth.
Yes, absolutely.
That's very exciting. And that Middle Earth tradition is so old, it's coming back to the English tradition. And we have that bedrock of the experience of the Tyburn martyrs as a kind of spiritual context. And the children dress up, they have swords, they have capes, and they go and fight orcs, and there's a whole kind of theatrical, immersive experience for them over the weekend. And it's in that context that we give catechesis.
Right.
So, I mean, this was really drawing from the ideas of the Jesuits. They were saying, if you want to keep someone in the faith for life, you need to capture the imagination.
Yeah.
Because that's enduring.
Yeah.
And ultimately, everybody is a storyteller.
Yeah.
You tell good stories at the beginning of someone's life, they'll resonate for them, resonate in them for the rest of their life.
Yes, yes.
So, new evangelization could also be about just reading the Lord of the Rings to your young children,
Yes.
getting them to embrace these deeper messages about Christ,
Yeah.
but firstly through their imagination.
Yeah.
How many people are watching The Lord of the Rings? There's the new Amazon show,
Right.
it's worth billions of pounds. You have things like Game of Thrones, which are spawning off Tolkien's kind of imagination. They're not telling very good stories in a way. They're telling the wrong story. So if we really return to Tolkien's own source of joy,
Yeah.
source of love, and we tell his story to capture the imagination of well, not only young people, but everybody who comes to these tales are going to leave better.
Yes.
They're going to leave with a better understanding of themselves, of the world. That's what John Henry Newman said he wanted. He said, everybody should leave you being a little bit better.
Right.
And I would say anybody who goes to Tolkien is going to leave being a little bit better.
That's fantastic.
And that's why I think he's holy. I think there's a great wealth there. There's a great wealth to explore in the church for re-finding the true story of this land.
Right.
It's here. And this story has been taken forward in different ways, but I think the Catholic heart needs to return to England. We need to find a way of being comfortable with our Catholic history. We're trying to. Go to a museum today, the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, people are queuing up to see those manuscripts.
That's true.
They love it,
Yeah.
they think it's so exciting.
Yeah.
That's our story. That's the foundation of why anybody goes to school during the week. Came out of the monasteries, we had a contemplative understanding of the world. That's why we needed to educate the young people. So actually the symptom of the post-Christian world is boredom. Boredom, frustration, anger. We don't know why. It's because we've lost the joy. We've lost the meaning. We've lost the truths that were at the core of our experience of life. Let's return to them, always in the way that Our Lady does, in a very gentle way.
So how could Tolkien's vision inspire Catholic education in England at the moment, or the UK?
It's a brilliant question, and my own answer to this, I have to say, I'm very, very indebted to the late Stratford Caldecott, who was an amateur, as he said, of the whole process of education, and specifically really fell in love with Tolkien. Tolkien was the means by which he became a Catholic, converting from a kind of neo-paganism, and then Tolkien really became a source of inspiration about what education was really at its core about. And I think as someone who is a teacher by profession, that is the thing you need to enkindle in young people. It's what Tolkien calls the secret fire, right? That is the project of a teacher, not only to be a professional by trade, but also to be a fire starter, right?
To inspire.
Well, I mean,
to inspire people's imaginations.
Well, yes, and I mean, with Gandalf particularly being a great teacher within the Lord of the Rings, he was a kind of troublemaker figure. There's a certain mischief at the root of anything that is a holy kind of mischief, let's say.
Yes.
What is it about a sunset? What is it about walking in a forest? What is it about seeing a lake that is so captivating? There is a kind of beauty that brings a holy wonder. It brings a certain excitement, a certain sense of life in all its colour and richness and glory. Teaching primarily has to tap into this. How are we going to really fill the children with wonder? Because it's difficult to do without getting them to know who they are. And I would say increasingly in this country we're being told you can't actually, in the name of protecting individual freedom, choice, dignity, we're actually stopping the whole project of what actually enables a young person to discover the depth of their identity, which is the sacred in them. Now, how are we going to do this? How are we going to enkindle in young people a sense of their own sacred dignity, purpose, project? Well, I think Tolkien has a lot of different ways of explaining how this might happen. He had children himself. 3. And he was a great educator to them. Having himself been orphaned, having himself had a strong oratorian formation, he wanted to impart wisdom to his children.
Right.
And he took the path of story.
Okay.
He wrote The Lord of the Rings for his children. It wasn't a narcissistic project. It was a project for others.
Yes.
And I think really what story enables you to do is to find unity again amidst all the complexities that a story might have.
Okay.
And that is something increasingly we're losing in the educational system. Caldecott makes this point at the beginning of one of his writings. He calls it the beauty for truth's sake on the re-enchantment of education. He says we need to make it enchanting again. En chanson, to be in a song. You need to find yourself within a wondrous song.
Right.
That's what Caldecott says the point of education is. And Caldecott would say, do we do this anymore if we fragment all our disciplines into different parts, and the children will find themselves increasingly as they do thinking that all the subjects are in opposition to each other. There is nothing that unifies them. Their understanding of God cannot really get beyond religious education, which is often seen as a bit of a joke, to be candid, in a lot of schools. It's compared to science and the truths that the immortal truths of, rational thought.
Sure.
Religious education struggles, can do anyway, to capture the imagination, the heart, the mind of young people.
Yes.
Caldecott is saying we need to, and he's drawing on Tolkien to say this. He says we need to try and re-find a way of drawing unity amongst all the disciplines.
So to use a phrase which is commonly associated with New Age, it's actually being holistic, but it's not in that sense. It's actually holistic as in unity, the connectedness between subjects and the unity within God's creation.
Yes, and the unity within God's creation should be the source of what the subjects are kind of finding their inspiration and what drives them on. I always say this to anybody. I teach science. I say, look, I teach science, I teach religious education. I do them both. Okay. Why are we looking at the created world? No, you can't say that as a scientist, but why are we looking at the cosmos, the world, where the cosmos even means order, where the language is betraying the structure of the project. But why are we looking at reality as if it had a purpose? That is the project of science. We're looking for the purpose. Yeah. That is the root project. It's kind of there is a faith that underlies the project of science itself. Yeah. Yeah. But I don't mind that. That is, you need to try and reawaken that sense. What is it that you're desiring in your education? What is going to give you an increase in your humanity? Right? Something unified will increase your humanity. And Tolkien, drawing from the medieval tradition, he's very aware that the disciplines do converge. In our tradition in this land, all of the disciplines came from philosophy and theology. Those were the first things taught in Oxford and Cambridge, in our monastic tradition. You start with philosophy, you end up in theology, which is the pinnacle of the intellectual project, because at that point you are going to bring about the great synthesis of all your knowledge. And Chesterton makes this point. He says actually the natural sciences are developing out of theology because we know that the world has purpose. It's not blind. So in a way, in a post-Christian world, we're kind of living off the vestiges of this truth. But we're not telling the story anymore very well, at least in the Catholic education system. We need to find a way to make it wondrous again, to speak about unity, to make it, the great romance of life. To try and discover the source of everything that I desire. Yes. God is the source of everything that I desire. That's great. That's a good thing to look for.
It certainly is. Okay, well, may it happen. So, Daniel, thank you very much for coming in to speak to us about Tolkien. It's been incredibly inspiring. I'm going to go and reread the works with a new light, and we hope that our viewers have found some truths from what you've just been saying.
Brilliant. Thank you so much.
Thank you.